A white-haired janitor pushed his broom down the gleaming corridor of West Burbridge Military Academy as if it were just another quiet morning. To most, he was a smudge in the background, a whisper trailing behind the polished boots of cadets destined for greatness. He came in before the sun, left after everyone else. No one knew his full name. No one asked. On his chest, no name tag. Just a faded gray uniform and a hat with one word embroidered above a military patch. Retired. The halls echoed with the crisp cadence of commands and laughter. Never with his voice. He didn't speak much. Some cadets claimed they'd never heard him say a single word. He just swept, always in rhythm, always on time, always invisible. They called him Commander Broom behind his back. Some said it with a smirk, others with mockery, but never with respect. Not openly, not sincerely. He was safe to ridicule. That's what they thought. That's what made it worse. Landon, a second-year cadet with a square jaw and confidence far exceeding his rank, took the lead in the jests. "Hey, Mop General," he shouted once, flicking an empty energy drink can toward the old man's cart. It clattered across the marble. The janitor glanced down but didn't pause. He simply picked it up and continued. "Man's too old to care," Landon muttered to his friend. "Probably just sticks around for the free lunch." They laughed, loud and satisfied, like children pulling wings off flies. But not everyone laughed. A few younger cadets, ones not yet fully molded by the arrogance that seeped through the academy's walls, felt uneasy watching the way the man was treated. There was something in the way he carried himself, something in his silence that felt deliberate. Not beaten down silence, not the silence of surrender. The silence of a man who had once spoken loudly in another world, and no longer needed to raise his voice to be heard. But they kept that discomfort to themselves. At Westburbridge, questioning your peers meant isolation, and no one wanted to eat alone. A week before the annual military symposium, a hallowed event that brought generals, war heroes, and dignitaries into the academy, tensions ran higher. Cadets rehearsed protocol, uniforms were triple-checked. Names of possible keynote speakers were whispered like sacred code, and somewhere in all the excitement, the jokes against the janitor escalated. It was Landon again who upped the ante. In the middle of a crowded breakfast hall, he spotted the old man pushing his cart past the tables. With a flick of his tray, scrambled eggs and toast and juice hit the floor like gunfire. "Oops," he grinned, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Clean up on aisle has been." Snickers followed. Even an instructor, seated nearby, chose to say nothing. The janitor bent down, as he always did, without complaint. No flicker of anger, no pause of hesitation. Just work. Measured. Quiet work. What they didn't know, what none of them even imagined, was that while they polished metals they hadn't yet earned, he polished memories that haunted him. He remembered men crying for their mothers in a language the world had no time to translate. He remembered giving orders with seconds to spare, knowing hesitation meant death. He remembered what it meant to be responsible for lives, and what it felt like to outlive every man in your unit. He remembered silence, not the kind these halls carried, but the silence after gunfire stops and you're the only one left breathing. So no, their jokes didn't break him. They just reminded him of how little they knew. He wasn't there for them. He wasn't there to be noticed. He was there because somewhere in these marble halls, there were names etched on a memorial wall that he couldn't stop visiting. Every day he stopped by the same photo, grainy, black and white, sandstorms swirling around a young officer saluting into a broken horizon. He never stayed long, just long enough to blink hard once, adjust his cap, and move on. If anyone had looked close enough, they might have noticed the way his hand hovered, almost unconsciously just below the frame, like a man remembering where a wound had been. The fake application was the last straw for some of the quieter cadets. One evening, a few of them found a printed form slipped into the janitor's cart. It read, "Application for Senior Custodial Commander, Expert in Mop Tactics and Stealth Sweeping." Landon had scrawled "Mop Few" under skills. Someone else added advanced trash deployment. The handwriting was juvenile. The cruelty wasn't. When the janitor found it, he unfolded it slowly, stared at it for a long moment, then folded it again clean, sharp creases, and placed it in his pocket, as if it were a classified document, as if it mattered. He didn't throw it away. That night, one of the junior cadets saw him sitting alone outside the academy chapel, the application still in his hand. The boy wanted to ask something, maybe say sorry, but when he approached, the janitor looked up, and in his eyes was something ancient, something that didn't ask for apology or pity, something that simply said, "You'll understand someday." The boy backed away, said nothing. By the morning of the symposium, the academy was a fortress of tension and protocol. Cadets stood at attention before dawn. Officers paced with earpieces and clipboards. The assembly hall was draped in banners, its stage polished, its podium adorned with the insignia of valor. The entire building held its breath for the arrival of the guest speaker, a legend among legends, General Marcus Denning. 4 stars, hundreds of operations, the kind of man whose shadow inspired books. Outside, unnoticed, the janitor moved down the hallway just like he always had. But this morning, he moved slower, not with pain, but with purpose. When he reached the corridor leading to the hall, he stopped, adjusted the brim of his cap, looked toward the double doors, behind which hundreds of futures waited to be rewritten. He didn't enter. He simply waited. Inside, the hall snapped to silence as the doors opened. General Denning walked in with the calm power of a storm that had already chosen its target. He didn't speak, didn't smile, just walked straight down the aisle past cadets, past instructors, past the honored seats reserved for greatness. And then he stopped. At the doorway, at the janitor. And what happened next? No one could have predicted, not even the instructors, not even Landon, whose smirk froze mid-lip. General Denning raised his hand and delivered a salute so precise, so formal, it cut through the air like a blade. And he said just loud enough for the front row to hear and for the whole room to feel, "Sir, it's an honor to finally meet you in person." Silence collapsed into stillness. Time paused, and the janitor, the man with the mop and the creased back and the hat that only said retired, returned the salute, not with performance, not with theatrics, but with the exact same movement he had done 1,000 times when it counted, when lives were measured in seconds, when commands were the only thing standing between home and a flag-draped coffin. The general turned to the stunned crowd. His voice was calm but sharp. "Before I begin my address, I want to recognize someone in this building who has shaped more lives than I ever will. A man whose leadership saved my life and the lives of 212 others during Operation Goliath. You know him as the janitor. I know him as Commander Elias Rohr." Gasps. One cadet dropped his notepad. Landon looked like someone had punched the breath out of him. The air changed. The room changed. Everything changed. But that is what came next. For now, remember this. They laughed. They mocked. They assumed. But respect isn't about medals. It isn't about titles. It's about sacrifice that asks for nothing, and history that doesn't need to shout to be remembered. Sometimes, the quietest man in the room is the one who commanded the most noise long ago, far away and never needed anyone to notice. Until now, it started with a mission, though no one knew it. Not the cadets who strutted through the academy's pristine halls, nor the instructors too busy reviewing schedules for the upcoming symposium to notice the subtle shift in the air. Not even the janitor himself, at least not in the way most would think of purpose. But something within him stirred, something that had long laid dormant under the routine of mops and trash bins, beneath the 1,000-yard stare of a man who had once led soldiers through hell and made it out alone. That morning, he didn't just rise before the sun. He sat at the edge of his bed for a full hour before the light broke through the blinds, holding a weathered notebook in his hands. The cover was frayed leather, its spine worn with time. Inside were names, no dates, no ranks. Just names. Some had been scratched through, never forgotten. but given a kind of closure, a silent send-off that only he could understand. Others remained untouched. Elias Rohr had never written in that notebook during his years at the academy. Not once, but that morning. He opened to a blank page, and for the first time in over a decade, he added a name. By the time he arrived on campus, the academy was a hive of movement. Flags were being raised with military precision. Young men rehearsed their salutes, repeating movements until their arms ached. The air buzzed with anxiety and pride. But under that was something else, something unspoken. A few cadets had begun to whisper, whispers about the salute, the general, the name Rohr. Not all had seen it, but those who had, those close enough to catch the moment when General Denning broke from protocol and paid his respects to a man in janitor's gray, were beginning to piece things together. A first-year named Jasper approached an upperclassman with a question that hung in the air like forbidden fruit. Is it true that the janitor, he's the Rohr? The older cadet didn't answer, just nodded slowly, like someone trying to reframe their entire worldview. Inside the janitor's closet, more a storage room than a personal space, Elias placed the notebook on a shelf, just above a row of cleaning supplies. No one had ever entered that room except him. It had become sacred in its obscurity. There were no medals hung, no photos of glory days or mementos of battles past. Just a single framed document folded behind a cracked glass pane. If someone had bothered to look close enough, they would have seen it wasn't a diploma or award. It was a handwritten note. The ink had faded over the years, but the words remained clear in Elias's mind. You were never just a leader. You were the reason we came back. M.D. He didn't need the signature to know who had written it. That day, the cleaning rounds continued as usual. On the surface, at least, the mop moved, the broom scraped, the trash was emptied, but eyes followed him now. Not all, but enough. A quiet wave of awareness moved through the campus, and with it came questions. A trio of cadets watched from the end of the corridor, unsure whether to approach. Should we thank him, one asked. For what, another replied, we don't even know what he did. The first cadet hesitated. Maybe that's the point. Elias passed them without a word, but he had heard. He always heard more than they realized. And while he showed no reaction, a flicker of something stirred in his chest. Not pride, but something heavier, closer to grief. It was strange how being noticed could feel just as heavy as being forgotten. Later that afternoon, the instructors gathered for a final briefing before the symposium. General Denning's appearance had created logistical panic. Every seat had to be reassigned, every protocol reviewed. But amidst the stress, one instructor, Captain Navarro, raised a different concern. We need to address what happened this morning, he said, voice steady but uneasy. With Commander Rohr, a few glanced up, eyebrows raised. Are you suggesting we acknowledge him during the ceremony? Another asked, already anticipating the controversy. No, Navarro said after a pause. I'm suggesting we remember who the hell he is. In the evening, the cadets filed into the assembly hall for a final walkthrough. Elias stood at the back, as he often did, pretending to clean a non-existent smudge on the marble. He watched as they rehearsed their movements, voices echoing off high ceilings. But something was off. One cadet broke formation mid-step. It was Landon. He paused, turned toward the janitor with a look that wasn't quite apology. Not yet. But no insult followed. No joke. Just a beat of silence between two men on opposite ends of experience. Elias gave the slightest nod, not as forgiveness, but as acknowledgement. A signal I see you trying. That night, he didn't go home. Instead, he walked the perimeter of the academy grounds, as if tracing old battlefield lines. He stopped under the shadow of the war memorial, where hundreds of names were carved in steel. The moonlight caught the metal, turning it ghostly. He ran his fingers over the names. None of them were his. He had never asked for his name to be listed. He had never wanted it. What mattered to him were the names he remembered, not the ones etched in stone, the ones who never came back, the ones who whispered to him in his dreams. Somewhere gone. Distant thunder rolled. Not a storm, just memory. Back inside, he sat in the chapel alone. It was a small room, rarely used. The light flickered from the altar candles, though no one had lit them in days. As the wax softened and leaned, Elias removed his cap and placed it gently on the pew beside him. His hand went to his chest, to a spot where once there had been a scar, not a wound from battle, but from a surgery that saved his life years after the war ended. He had never told anyone about it. It wasn't in any record, but to him, it was the moment he realized life after combat wasn't survival, it was penance. He whispered a name then, just one. The same one he had written in the notebook that morning. A young man who'd served under him, who had jumped on a grenade before anyone else could react. Elias had held him in the dirt, blood pooling too fast, air escaping too slow. He had promised he would never let the world forget, and for years he had kept that promise. Alone, silently, at sunrise, Elias walked through the halls with slower steps than usual. Not because of age, because he knew what was coming. Rumors had become certainty. Eyes now followed him with more than curiosity. There was weight behind the stairs. Some instructors nodded as he passed. Others looked away, ashamed of what they had failed to see. A few cadets stood straighter in his presence, and when he entered the cafeteria, no one mocked. No trays fell, no jokes echoed. Instead, a strange stillness took hold, as if everyone had agreed, without words, that silence was the only sound he deserved. He made his way to a table in the back, sat alone, began his breakfast like he had every day for the past decade. But this time, a tray landed across from his. He looked up. It was Landon. No words. Just a tray, a nod, and a chair pulled out. Then another cadet joined, and another, until the table was full. No one spoke. They just ate. Respect had arrived quietly, without ceremony, without orders. And as Elias looked around for the first time in many years, he allowed himself a single thought he hadn't dared entertain. Maybe, just maybe, this place remembered after all. The morning of the symposium arrived with the kind of thick, silent anticipation that even the most seasoned instructors could feel pressing against their collars. The air was heavy with tension, the type that made cadets instinctively straighten their backs and adjust their cuffs for the fifth or sixth time, even though their uniforms were already flawless. It was a kind of performance, not just for the general who would be arriving, but for the legacy of the academy itself. West Barbridge had always prided itself on discipline, tradition, precision, but today, beneath that surface, something else was stirring. A truth long buried beneath polished floors and whispered jokes was beginning to find breath again. And that truth, quiet and unyielding, was walking down the back hallway with a broom in hand and no fanfare in his step. Elias Rohr had not altered his routine. That was not his way. But today, even he could feel the shift around him. He noticed how cadets hesitated when they passed him in the halls, not out of fear, but something closer to reverence, though they didn't quite know how to show it. Some offered brief nods. A few murmured, "Sir," under their breath, uncertain if it was the right word, but unable to say anything less. He responded only with his eyes, a flicker of acknowledgement, quiet and sufficient. That morning, one of the instructors, Major Hallbridge, intercepted him as he pushed his cart down the east wing. The major was younger than Elias by several decades, his chest decorated with service ribbons that glinted under the hallway lights, but his voice held an unsteady tremor. "Commander Rohr," he began, the title sounding foreign in his mouth. Elias stopped, glanced up with a slight lift of his brow. "Well, some of us were talking, and we thought perhaps," he faltered, "perhaps you'd consider joining the general on stage today. For the keynote." A pause. Elias studied the man for a long moment, and though his expression didn't change, Hallbridge suddenly felt as though the silence itself were measuring him. "I'll be where I've always been," Elias said, his voice calm and firm like worn oak. At the back, the major nodded stiffly, cleared his throat, and stepped aside. Elias continued down the hall. In the barracks, the cadets were dressing in silence. For once, no one was joking or tossing insults. There was no music playing. Landon stood at the mirror, fixing his tie, his fingers fumbling more than usual. He had barely slept. The image of General Denning saluting the janitor had looped in his mind like a broken reel of film. Every smirk, every tray he had dropped, every name he had called now felt like gravel in his stomach. Behind him, his roommate Jasper tightened his own collar and muttered, "Do you think he'll say anything Landon didn't need to ask who he meant?" "I don't know," he replied, "but if he does, we better be ready to listen." As the cadets filed into the grand assembly hall, the sound of chairs scraping and boots stepping echoed like a solemn drumbeat. The ceiling arched above them like the spine of some ancient cathedral, banners of past graduating classes hanging like silent judges. On stage, the podium stood waiting. Rows of instructors lined the side aisles. Photographers and local media had already begun snapping early frames. Near the back of the hall, unnoticed by most, Elias stepped inside. He leaned his broom against the wall and took his usual place standing along the side, just behind a pillar near the entrance, where the light from the stained glass windows spilled in stripes across the floor. General Denning had not yet arrived. A hush settled across the room, the kind that makes people shift in their seats, not from discomfort, but from the weight of knowing something bigger than them is about to happen. Then, without announcement, the rear doors opened, and Denning entered. No music, no trumpet, just his presence. Commanding, still, like a mountain walked into the room. Every cadet rose. Salutes snapped into place. Elias didn't move, not because of protest, but because he had already been saluted by the man himself, and that was enough. Denning stepped to the podium. He did not open with a joke. He didn't read from notes. Instead, he let the silence speak a few beats longer. Then his voice filled the space, rich and low. "There are days in a soldier's life when the battle is not the hardest part," he began. "It's what comes after. The silence, the memory, the burden." Cadets leaned forward, their posture unconsciously attentive. Denning paused, then continued. "Today by me, I was asked to give a keynote address about leadership, about courage. But before I do, I need to correct something. A mistake. Not made today, but made every day. For the last 10 years. In this very building." Whispers flickered at the room's edge, hushed and uncertain. Denning gestured toward the back. "There's a man standing there right now. Many of you know him as the janitor. Some of you, I regret to say, have mocked him, ignored him, dismissed him. But I know him by another name. Commander Elias Rohr." All eyes turned. A ripple of disbelief moved like wind through tall grass. "During Operation Goliath, in the deadliest terrain I've ever set foot on, that man held our unit together when everything fell apart. He led us through 46 hours of sustained enemy fire. He mapped our extraction under blackout. He carried 2 wounded soldiers across 4 clicks of hostile terrain. One of them was me." For a moment, no one breathed. Denning's voice dropped lower. "When I saluted him yesterday, it wasn't to honor the janitor. It was to honor the man who gave me back my life." Elias still hadn't moved. Not until Denning turned toward him fully and said, "Sir, with your permission, I would like to offer you the stage." And then, for the first time in front of all those who had overlooked him, Elias stepped forward. No fanfare, no music, just footsteps. Slow, steady, certain. He reached the stage and took the microphone. It was quiet enough to hear the hum of the air conditioning, the faint buzz of camera lenses focusing. He looked over the crowd, not with judgment, but with clarity. Then he spoke. "I came here to clean, not just these floors," he began, voice rough and deep, "but to stay close to something I lost a long time ago. Brotherhood, purpose, memory." His eyes moved over the rows. "I didn't speak because I had nothing to prove. My stories, they belong to the dead." The room remained still. Some cadets shifted, emotion welling. But I watched you, he continued, and I hoped quietly that one day one of you might see me not as a janitor, but as a man who once stood where you now sit, thinking he knew everything. A soft laugh, dry and without bitterness. You don't know everything. Not yet, but maybe now you'll listen. He ended his speech not with a quote or a dramatic exit, but with a single line, be better than me, but never forget men like me. He returned the mic to the stand, turned, and walked off stage. As he passed the first row, cadets began to rise. One by one, no command given, no order shouted. They stood, all of them, and in complete silence. Each cadet lifted their hand and saluted. The old man did not stop. He didn't bow, didn't wave. He picked up his broom from the wall near the entrance and walked out the same way he had walked in, quiet, measured, alone, but not unseen. For the first time in years, he was remembered. Not as a myth, not as a rumor, but as a man who had lived the loudest life in the quietest way. And though he returned to his modest home that night with no ceremony, no interview, no parade, he opened his old notebook once more, flipped past the names, and wrote a final line at the bottom of the page. They stood. Then he closed it, placed it on the table beside his cap, and for the first time in a very long time, he slept without ghosts, without noise, just peace. The next day, the halls of West Burbridge Military Academy were quieter than usual. Not silent, but subdued, like the air itself had shifted its weight. The usual banter between cadets in the early morning was replaced by something different in awareness. The kind of awareness that stays with you after something inside you has been rearranged. The night before, they had watched a man many of them had dismissed, mocked, or ignored step onto a stage not with ego, but with truth, and speak not with volume, but with history. And they had stood for him. Every single one of them. Not because someone told them to, but because something inside demanded it. Yet the academy didn't stop. Routines had to continue. Classes resumed. Drills commenced. Marches echoed across the courtyard. But beneath the surface, in the glances exchanged in hallways and the small shifts in posture when the janitor passed by, something lingered, respect born not from rank, but from revelation. Elias Rohr arrived at the same time he always did, before the sun had finished its climb. His steps were steady, his uniform unchanged. He pushed the same cart, mopped the same floors, and greeted no one with words, yet said more in his presence than most did with entire speeches. But the way the cadets moved around him had changed. There was no more joking, no more eye-rolling. Now there were quiet nods, held doors, and a kind of silent reverence that neither he asked for nor encouraged. He didn't need it. He didn't want it. But he noticed, in the officers' quarters, the instructors gathered for a routine meeting, but the tone was different. Captain Navarro, who had once been quick to dismiss rumors of the janitor's past, now sat silently flipping through an old personnel file that had been unsealed just that morning. Inside were mission reports, commendations, handwritten debriefings signed by generals long retired. Commander Elias Rohr, the top page read, Black Ops clearance level red, served in Operation Goliath, Hammer Vale, Desert Echo, confirmed field leader, survivability rating exceptional. Navarro leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. We had a living legend in our building, he said, almost to himself. Another instructor, Lieutenant Mayers, shook her head, and we almost let the cadets break him. Navarro looked up. No, they couldn't. That's the point. He never gave them the chance. There was silence around the table, not uncomfortable, but reflective. Elsewhere on campus, in the North Wing training field, cadets were running through obstacle courses. Landon, once the loudest, now moved with quiet purpose. He hadn't spoken much since the symposium. During morning PT, he had pulled a cadet aside who had chuckled under his breath after nearly tripping over a sandbag. This place doesn't need your sarcasm, he said, not cruelly, but directly. It needs your attention. The younger cadet blinked, surprised. Yes, sir, he replied, unsure what had just happened. Landon didn't wait for further conversation. He simply turned and rejoined the line. A few cadets had noticed. They talked about it in whispers. He's different now, Jasper said to another, something about what happened with Roar. It hit him. The other cadet nodded. It hit all of us. At lunch, Elias sat where he always sat, far in the back, against the wall, a corner table with one chair. But he wasn't alone. Over the past week, more cadets had begun joining him, one at a time, no questions, no grand gestures, just quiet meals. One young woman, Cadet Allen, brought him an extra napkin and a cup of coffee without saying a word. She didn't sit. She just placed them beside him and nodded once. Elias glanced at the coffee, then at her. His eyes didn't soften. They didn't need to. But he gave her something, a brief, almost imperceptible nod that to her felt like a medal. Later that afternoon, the Academy's headmaster, Colonel Whitaker, summoned Elias to his office. It wasn't a demand. It was a request delivered with unusual humility. Elias knocked once, then stepped inside. The room was polished, traditional, walls lined with plaques and framed certificates. Whitaker stood as he entered, a gesture Elias noted silently. Commander, the colonel began, hesitating on the title. I've been reviewing your file. I must admit, I'm ashamed it took me this long. Elias didn't respond. Whitaker cleared his throat. There's talk about creating a new leadership course, something rooted in lived experience. Not just theory. I'd like you to consider leading it. Elias raised an eyebrow, the only visible reaction. I don't teach, he said flatly. With respect, sir, you already have. Whitaker replied, they've learned more from your silence than most learn from lectures. Elias looked away for a moment, his gaze settling on a photograph of the Academy taken decades earlier. Then he turned back. I'll think about it. Whitaker nodded. That was more than he'd expected. That evening, Elias walked the perimeter of the Academy grounds again. This time, he was not alone. Landon followed at a respectful distance before finally catching up beside him. Sir, he began. Elias kept walking. Landon continued, matching his pace. I wanted to say something, not just sorry, but thank you. Elias didn't stop. For what he asked, for letting us make fools of ourselves without hating us for it. Elias finally slowed, turned slightly. Who says I didn't? Landon looked startled, but then saw the flicker of dry humor in the older man's eyes. He laughed, softly. Elias continued walking. You're not fools, he said after a pause. You're just unfinished. The two walked in silence after that, but it was a silence filled with understanding. The week passed, and the Academy felt different. Not louder, not busier, but more awake. Cadets began referring to each other with more patience. Instructors found themselves reevaluating their roles not as dispensers of orders, but as models of resilience. Elias continued his work, never missing a day. But whispers began that something bigger was happening. Someone had seen him reading in the library. Someone else said they saw him speaking quietly with the leadership board. Then came the notice, an optional seminar, Leadership Under Fire, a Legacy Perspective. Guest facilitator, Commander Elias Rohr. It filled up in 2 hours. On the day of the first session, Elias entered the lecture hall wearing the same gray uniform, his cap in his hand. He did not stand behind the podium. He stood in front of it. I don't speak much, he began. That's not a style. That's a survival instinct. But I agreed to this because leadership is not a theory. It's a burden. It's memory. And it's a choice. He walked slowly across the room. You want to be leaders. Then learn how to carry weight that doesn't show up on any manifest. Learn how to walk into a room and know who's missing without asking. Learn how to return home with medals that feel too heavy and friends you never got to bury. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Every cadet sat frozen and listening. I'm not here to inspire you. I'm here to prepare you. Because if you're lucky, you'll never have to become me. But if you're called to, I want you to survive it. When he left the room, no one clapped. No one needed to. They just sat there, absorbing it, understanding that something had just been passed down not in words, but in presence. Back in his quarters that night, Elias opened his notebook again. He didn't write a name this time. He simply added a line beneath the last. Some of them are ready. Then he closed the book, placed it back on the shelf, and stared out the window. Not toward the past, but toward the future. And for the first time in decades, he didn't just remember. He hoped. Rain fell softly against the academy windows as the week rolled on. A rhythmic hush that blanketed the campus in a sense of reflection more than gloom. Cadets moved between buildings with coats pulled tight and eyes lowered, not out of disrespect, but introspection. Something had shifted, not in policy, not in procedure, but in posture. In the way voices dropped a little lower when discussing discipline, in the way laughter gave way to measured silence when someone mentioned the janitor who wasn't a janitor. Elias Rohr was still performing the same task each day, pushing the mop, emptying bins, cleaning the same corners he always had. But now, cadets unconsciously stepped aside to clear his path. Some nodded. A few even offered quiet good mornings. He acknowledged them all with minimal gestures. A subtle glance, a tilt of the head, a recognition that required no ceremony. Inside the newly launched seminar room, the air was different than any other classroom on campus. Rows of cadets sat with notebooks open but rarely used them. They wrote less than they listened. Elias spoke sparingly, sometimes for no more than 10 minutes at a time, then let silence stretch like a lesson in itself. He asked questions that had no easy answers. What do you carry that no one can see? What command would you refuse to follow? What loss would break you? And how would you lead anyway? These were not lessons taught in textbooks or through simulation drills. These were hard truths spoken by a man who had learned them the long way, the painful way. A few instructors sat in on the seminars, not because they had to, but because they needed to. Lieutenant Mayers often sat in the back, notebook shut, hands clasped tight, her eyes never leaving Elias as he paced slowly before the class. She had served overseas once, in a shorter, less complicated war, and though she'd returned with medals, she never spoke of it. Watching him, she began to understand her own silence better. Word spread that General Denning had sent a formal commendation to the Academy Board, urging them to recognize Commander Rohr's contributions to national service and suggesting they name one of the new leadership programs in his honor. But Elias declined the idea when presented. You don't put names on wisdom, he said. You just pass it on. One afternoon, while performing his usual rounds, Elias passed the main lounge area where several cadets sat clustered around a screen, watching footage of a declassified segment from Operation Goliath. The black and white video, grainy and flickering, showed a group of soldiers moving through narrow canyon passes under heavy fire. One figure appeared briefly silent, deliberate, issuing hand signals, guiding others without a word. That's him, one cadet whispered. That's Rohr. Another leaned closer. He looks younger, but it's the same eyes. The video cut out just as a flash of mortar fire consumed part of the screen. Silence followed. No one spoke. They didn't need to. That night, Elias received an envelope slid under his door. Inside was a handwritten letter. No name, just, you taught me how to lead without shouting. I don't know if I'll ever be like you, but I want to try. At the bottom, a quote he'd said during the seminar was written in blocky, unsure handwriting. Be better than me, but never forget men like me. He folded the paper once and placed it inside the notebook. A name followed on the next blank line. It was not the name of someone who had died. It was someone still learning to live. In the following days, something unexpected happened. A small group of cadets, entirely of their own volition, began organizing a volunteer mentorship program for underperforming first years. They called it the The quiet watch, a nod to how Elias had always watched over them, unnoticed. The instructors approved it quickly. Even the board took notice, but Elias never commented on it. He didn't need to. They weren't doing it for praise. They were doing it because they'd been seen by a man who carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken things, and somehow they felt compelled to carry a piece of that weight forward. Then, one afternoon, the news came. An old comrade of Elias, Colonel Richard Brick Callahan, had passed away in a veterans care facility 2 states over. Elias received the message without a flicker of visible emotion, but he left early that day, the first time in years. He didn't say where he was going, didn't explain, but the next morning, on the table inside the seminar room, a single folded note was left behind, gone to say goodbye to the last man who understood the things I never said. No signature, just that. He returned 2 days later. No fanfare, no speech, but he walked a little slower, not from grief, from memory. Some cadets noticed his shoulders seemed heavier, not in defeat, but in quiet mourning. They gave him space, but they also gave him presence, walking beside him without a word, like an unspoken escort. Landon approached him later that evening. Was he a good man? Elias looked up from the table where he was replacing the bristles on a worn mop. He was a complicated man. He said, "Goodness is a luxury we don't always have in war." But he never left a man behind. Not once. Landon nodded slowly. Then that's good enough. Elias didn't respond. He just resumed fixing the mop. But his hands moved slower, as if weighed down by something heavier than the task itself. In the weeks that followed, the Academy began receiving letters from veterans, some of whom had served with or under Commander Rohr, testimonials of quiet heroism, of midnight evacuations, of the man who stayed behind to cover their retreat. One story spoke of him sharing his last canteen with a wounded enemy soldier during a ceasefire pause. He didn't see uniforms. The letter read, he saw people. And he taught us to do the same. These letters were eventually compiled into a binder. Unofficial at first, cadets passed it around. Some cried, others were stunned, but all of them felt something shift again, a deeper understanding of the man who swept their halls. One cold morning, as snow dusted the academy lawn, Elias arrived earlier than usual. He stood outside the chapel, not going in, just watching the frost climb the windows. Captain Navarro saw him from across the courtyard and walked over. "You thinking of retiring?" he asked. Elias didn't answer right away. Then he said, "I'm thinking of leaving before they forget again." Navarro frowned. "They won't." Elias turned to face him. "They always do. That's why we write things down. That's why we teach." Navarro nodded, unsure how to respond. "What would you do instead?" Elias looked toward the mountains in the distance. "Maybe I'll go walk until I find a place quiet enough to remember everything, or forget it all." As the season deepened and the year neared its end, the Academy prepared for a closing ceremony unlike any before. Not for medals, not for achievements, but for memory. The cadets petitioned to rename the lecture hall where Elias had taught his seminar. They wanted to call it the Rower Room. He declined. Again. "Name it after the ones who never got to come home," he said. "They're the ones who made me worth remembering." But late one night, after the halls had emptied and the lights had dimmed, a small bronze plaque was quietly mounted by a few cadets at the corner of the seminar room door. It didn't say his name. It simply read, "For the man who taught us to lead in silence." Elias found it the next morning. He stared at it for a long time. Then, for the first time anyone could recall, he smiled. Not wide, not showy. Just a slight, quiet curve of the lips, as if something in him had finally been put down. And then he picked up his broom, nodded once to the empty hallway, and kept walking. Winter at Westburbridge came not with blizzards or ice storms, but with a steady, bone-deep chill that curled around the edges of the buildings and seeped into every stone and corridor. The frost collected like breath on windows, and cadets learned to move a little faster between buildings, shoulders hunched, collars up. Inside, the academy maintained its discipline, but a gentler rhythm had found its way into the days. Like the campus itself was breathing differently. In the weeks following the plaque's appearance, subtle, unsigned, reverent, the presence of Elias Rohr seemed to have expanded beyond his physical shadow. Though he remained the same quiet figure pushing his cart, cadets now listened more closely when he passed, not to hear what he might say, but to witness how he carried himself. He had become something else, something rarer than a war hero or an instructor. He had become a mirror, and in that reflection, those around him began to recognize what kind of leaders they truly wanted to be. The seminar continued twice a week. Attendance was no longer optional, not by policy, but by silent agreement. Even instructors started forming a line at the back wall just to hear a few words. In one particular session, Elias stood longer than usual before he spoke, watching the cadets as they shifted in their seats, waiting. Then he asked, "What would you die for?" The room froze. He let the question hang. "I'm not asking what you'd fight for," he added. "Fighting is easy. I'm asking what you would choose to die for and still believe it was worth it." A long silence followed. Then a voice clear but hesitant from the middle of the room. "The man next to me." Elias turned slightly toward the speaker. "Then make sure you know him well, because if you don't, you won't know what you're dying for. And worse, you might not know who died for you." After class, Elias was approached by Cadet Allen, the same young woman who had once brought him coffee without a word. She stood in his path but did not speak immediately. He waited. "Sir," she finally said, "have you ever regretted coming back?" Elias looked at her, not surprised by the question, but by the courage it took to ask it. "Every day," he answered. "And yet, here I am." Her eyes softened. Because of us, he considered that. Because someone had to remember. And because someone needed to see what happens when you forget. She nodded, then stepped aside to let him pass. That exchange, quiet as it was, would ripple through her life more than she'd realize at the time. That same week, the Academy prepared for its end-of-year review, a ceremony that traditionally focused on achievements, promotions, and commendations. But this year, the cadets petitioned for a change. Instead of awards, they wanted a remembrance ceremony not just for those currently enrolled, but for all who had served and sacrificed. They wanted to call it the Quiet March. When the request reached Colonel Whitaker, he approved it without hesitation. What surprised him more was the request that followed. The cadets wanted Elias Rohr to lead the procession. Whitaker found Elias in the far maintenance wing, replacing a broken filter in the heating unit. "Commander," he said with a small smile. Elias stood up slowly, wiping his hands with a rag. "They're asking you to lead the remembrance ceremony." Whitaker continued. "The cadets," it was unanimous. Elias didn't respond right away. He folded the rag, placed it on the cart, and turned toward the colonel. "Will they be marching for the living or the dead?" Whitaker blinked. "Both," he said. Elias gave a short nod. "Then I'll walk." Preparations began. No uniforms would be adorned with medals, no music would be played. Just silence, footsteps, and names, each cadet assigned to carry a name of someone who never returned. On the day of the march, the sky was overcast, the ground hard with frost. Elias wore his janitor's uniform, untouched, unadorned, save for his cap. He stood at the front of the formation, flanked by Landon on his right and Cadet Allen on his left. Behind them, hundreds of cadets stood in rows, each holding a folded card with a name. No speeches were given. At 0900, Elias took the first step. The march wound through the academy grounds in absolute silence. No cameras, no press. Just breath and boots and memory. As they reached the war memorial wall, Elias stopped. One by one, cadets approached the stone, placed their card at its base, and saluted. Some trembled, a few wept, not from sadness alone, but from recognition of what had come before them, of what they were becoming, of what leadership truly demanded. When the last card was placed, Elias stepped forward. He looked at the wall but said nothing. Then, in a motion as precise as any he'd ever made in combat, he raised his hand in a final salute. The cadets followed, one by one, until the courtyard stood in still reverence, a sea of silent salutes facing a wall of names. That night, something unexpected occurred. A letter arrived at the academy addressed to Elias Rohr, postmarked from a small town in Iowa. Inside was a single photo, yellowed, creased, showing a younger Elias with his unit, all of them grinning, dusty, alive. On the back, a message: "You saved me. I never said thank you." I couldn't find the words. "I hope this is enough. James." Elias sat with the photo for a long time. Then he added one more name to the notebook. Not a fallen, a survivor. His hands trembled slightly as he wrote. Not from age, from weight. Weeks later, as spring hinted its approach with thin rays of sun and the snow began to pull back from the grass, Elias stood again outside the seminar room. His lectures had ended. His lessons complete, cadets passed him with nods that meant more than words. One left a folded letter on his cart. Another gave a simple thank you with eyes full of meaning. And then Landon approached. "Sir," he said, voice steady, "I've applied for field command. I'm not sure I'm ready, but I'm going." Elias studied him. "No one is ready," he said, "but if you lead from silence, and you remember the ones you can't bring back, you'll make it home, even if part of you stays out there." That night, Elias walked alone through the campus one final time, retracing his steps through every corridor, past the halls he had cleaned, past the room where he had once been laughed at, past the seminar where silence had become scripture. He stopped at the plaque outside the room, touched it once, then turned and walked into the dark. Behind him, the academy lights remained, but for the first time, they didn't feel like a burden to him. They felt like a promise. And somewhere deep in his notebook, behind the names, behind the lines written in fading ink, a new page waited, blank. Not because there was nothing left to write, but because it was no longer his story alone. It belonged to the ones who would carry it forward, quietly, honorably, unseen but unforgettable. Spring arrived like a whisper at West Burbridge, melting away the last traces of snow with a gentleness that matched the subtle changes taking root within its walls. The cherry trees in the east courtyard began to bloom in delicate pinks and whites, shedding petals that drifted silently over the stone walkways like tiny, fragile parachutes. The air had lost its bite, replaced by something softer, something that felt like forgiveness. Cadets still marched. Orders were still barked. Timetables still ruled every hour of the day. But beneath the ironclad routine, there was a quiet revolution underway, one that had not been commanded into existence but inspired. Elias Rohr was no longer just the man with the mop. He had become the cadence in their silence, the weight behind their salutes, the reason why certain cadets now paused at the memorial wall each morning before training began. He had not asked to be followed, nor had he ever raised his voice to teach. Yet the academy had reshaped itself around his presence like water bending around a rock. His seminars had ended weeks ago, and though he had returned to his maintenance duties as if nothing had changed, everyone around him knew better. Every floor he cleaned felt like sacred ground. Every hallway he passed through seemed to straighten itself. Cadets who once brushed past him without notice now greeted him with crisp nods or quietly left a cup of coffee on his cart. There were no longer whispers about who he was. Everyone knew. But knowing didn't bring noise. It brought reflection. One morning, as Elias replaced the light bulbs in the south corridor, a cadet stopped beside him and said, "I was going to quit. Before I heard you speak. Now I just want to be someone worth remembering." Elias didn't reply. He handed the cadet the screwdriver without a word, letting him finish the work. That was the lesson. Across campus, the Quiet Watch program had expanded. Once a small, peer mentoring circle, it had grown into a core part of cadet life. Participation was voluntary, yet nearly every cadet had joined in some capacity. The program didn't just help struggling recruits, it created a culture of accountability without shame, of discipline rooted in respect rather than fear. Landon had emerged as an unlikely mentor, his transformation no longer a point of discussion, but simply a fact. He walked with less swagger, more purpose. One afternoon, after a long day on the field, he stopped by the janitor's room. Elias looked up from repairing a broken mop handle. "I'm leaving in 3 weeks," Landon said. "Commissioned overseas." Elias didn't answer. He just nodded. "You ever afraid to leave?" Landon asked. Elias studied the handle in his hands. "Always," he said, "but leaving is part of serving. Coming back is the hard part." Landon looked down at his boots. "I'll remember what you said about silence, about carrying weight." Elias met his eyes. "Just don't carry it alone." That night, Elias returned to his quarters simple, neat, unchanged in years. He sat at his desk and opened the notebook, the one that now had more names than he cared to count. At the back, he flipped to the last filled page and ran a finger along the ink. Then, for the first time in a long time, he didn't write a name. He wrote a thought. Maybe the next war isn't out there. Maybe it's the one we fight inside, every day, just to stay decent. He closed the book and stared out the window, where the campus glowed softly under the crescent moon. Somewhere distant, laughter rose from the barracks. It wasn't the cruel, careless laughter of before. It was lighter, human, whole. In the days that followed, several instructors approached Elias with a request, one that had come directly from the academy board. They wanted to film an oral history, not for publicity, not for recruitment, but for the archive, for the truth. Elias declined at first, but eventually, after some consideration, he agreed under one condition: it would not be edited. No music, no titles, just him, a chair, and the camera. The interview took place in the chapel, a place he had often visited alone. The room was empty except for the man behind the lens and a single cadet assigned to record audio. Elias sat down and looked into the camera without adjusting his posture or clearing his throat. "I'm not going to tell you stories," he began. "You've heard enough stories. I'm going to tell you consequences." And then for the next 3 hours, he spoke not about tactics, not about medals or missions, but about loss, about silence, about the weight of surviving when others didn't. "I don't remember all the names," he said at one point, voice trembling for the first time, "but I remember the sound of them, the sound of someone saying their name before it vanished forever." When the recording ended, no one clapped. They just let the silence linger, as if applause would cheapen what had been shared. The footage would later be shown only once during a cadet leadership retreat. It wouldn't be made public. That was Elias's condition. But those who watched it would never forget it. One cadet said afterward, "He didn't teach us how to lead. He showed us how not to disappear." One morning, as spring matured into something warmer, more alive, Elias received a letter this time, not from a comrade or a cadet, but from the Department of Defense. They were offering a citation upgrade, a medal, long overdue, for actions during Operation Goliath that had finally been declassified. They asked if he would attend a ceremony. Elias read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer. The medal arrived a month later in a velvet box, unopened, sitting quietly next to a spool of mop string and a bottle of cleaning solvent. He didn't display it, didn't mention it, but when Cadet Allen happened upon the box by accident, he simply said, "That one's for the dead, not for me." Later that week, the cadets organized a memorial planting a tree in the central courtyard, surrounded by plaques not with names but with principles: respect, silence, courage, presence. They asked Elias to speak. He declined, but he attended, and when the final shovel of soil was placed, he stepped forward, placed his cap against the trunk, and stood there for a moment, eyes closed. A breeze rustled the new leaves above him. No one spoke. No one needed to. In the final days of the semester, as cadets prepared for deployment, graduation, or simply the next phase of their training, Elias made one final round of the academy, not as a farewell, not with ceremony, but with intent. He checked the boilers, replaced 2 flickering lights in the main hall, tightened the squeaky hinge on the western wing's supply closet, and when he returned to his room that night, he packed only one thing: his notebook. He left a single slip of paper on his bed. It had no signature, no message beyond a line written in small, even script. The floors are clean. You keep the rest. When the cadets found it the next morning, they knew he was gone. But even in his absence, Elias Rohr remained. In the way they stood, in the way they listened, in the way they remembered. Some said he had walked into the mountains, seeking quiet. Others believed he'd gone to visit the graves of those who hadn't come home. But most simply said, he went where he was needed next. And long after, when new cadets arrived and asked about the man in the old photograph by the seminar door, the one with tired eyes and a quiet strength, the answer was always the same. He didn't lead us from the front. They would say, he led us from the shadows. And somehow that's what brought us into the light. The summer came in quietly that year, as if it knew the space it was entering had been altered not by noise or triumph, but by stillness and the kind of presence that lingers long after footsteps fade. West Barbridge Academy moved forward, as institutions always do. The cadets graduated. New recruits arrived, their faces fresh with ambition and ignorance in equal measure. Uniforms still gleamed, orders still rang out across the courtyard, and the drills still began each morning at the same time. But underneath the surface, in places the handbook could never reach, something had shifted permanently. The halls remembered. The silence remembered. And though Elias Rohr was no longer seen mopping floors or replacing lights in quiet corners, his influence remained embedded in the very marrow of the place. The Quiet Watch had become more than a mentorship program. It was now woven into the academy's fabric. New cadets didn't just learn from instructors or textbooks. They were paired with seniors who carried the unspoken teachings passed down by Elias himself. The lessons were never officially recorded. They didn't need to be. They lived in gestures, in moments of reflection, in the weight behind a pause before speaking, or the sincerity behind a simple nod. In the leadership seminar room, the one with the discreet bronze plaque by the door, a new tradition had started. For the first class of every term, cadets sat in silence for 60 seconds. No instruction was given, no explanation. It was simply understood. A moment to remember the cost of leadership. A moment to remember the man who taught them what that word meant. One morning, early in the semester, a young cadet named Rafi stood by the plaque, tracing the engraved letters with his fingers. He had arrived just weeks earlier, knew nothing of Elias firsthand, but had heard the stories passed from bunk to bunk like sacred lore. He turned to his mentor, Cadet Allen, and asked, "Do you think he knew what he was doing?" Allen looked at the plaque, then back at Rafi. "I think he knew exactly what he was doing," she said. "That's why he never had to explain it." Instructors who once carried themselves with formal detachment now moved differently through the halls. Major Halbridge began ending each lecture with a question instead of a directive. Lieutenant Mayers kept a copy of the oral history recording tucked into her desk, and on days when she doubted the meaning of her post, she would watch it again not to remember Elias, but to remember herself. Colonel Whitaker, once known for his rigid formality, now left the chapel door unlocked at all hours. A few cadets had walked in late at night and found him sitting alone, not praying, not speaking, just sitting, listening, perhaps for an echo. Letters continued to arrive addressed to Elias. Some came from veterans, others from strangers who had heard about him through whispers or through the guarded release of a few written tributes. The Academy never returned the letters. Instead, they created a small archive in the back room of the seminar hall. It wasn't open to the public. Cadets had to request access, and when they did, they were given a key and left alone with the pages. Most read in silence. Some cried. A few left letters of their own behind, folded and placed neatly in the back. Over time, the room grew heavier, not with sorrow, but with gratitude. A living dialogue between the remembered and the remembering. Then, one autumn morning, nearly a year after his quiet departure, a package arrived. It was wrapped in plain brown paper. No return address. No markings beyond the words, "For the next." Inside was a single leather-bound notebook. Worn, familiar. On the first page, A line had been added in clean. Careful script. Names matter. Because stories are carried by names. Below that, the first name Landon R., the same cadet who once mocked him, the same cadet who had changed. There were others. Dozens. Some were cadets, some were soldiers, some were bio, others still living. But all had been carried by Elias at some point, in silence, in memory, in spirit. Colonel Whitaker brought the notebook into the seminar room himself. He placed it on a wooden stand beneath a protective glass case, not to elevate it, but to preserve it. Above the case, a small placard was added. It read, "The weight we carry." Every cadet who passed through the program was given a copy of a page, one name, one story, and told, "This is who you lead for." No speeches were given, no performances, just names and memories. One day, deep into the second year since Elias left, a cadet named Mira Chen stood at the front of the leadership seminar room to deliver her final presentation. Her voice was calm, measured, but full of something real. "When I arrived here," she said, "I thought leadership was about speaking louder than the next person. I thought it was about confidence, about presence. But now I know it's about what you do when no one is watching. It's about cleaning up messes you didn't make. It's about seeing people no one else notices." That's what Commander Rohr did. He saw us before we saw ourselves. When she finished, no applause followed, only silence. The kind of silence that Elias had once wielded like a weapon, like a bomb. Later that week, a maintenance worker found something etched in the wood beneath one of the benches in the chapel. It wasn't graffiti. It was too deliberate, too careful. It read, "He never asked to be followed. We just didn't want to be lost." No one claimed it. No one removed it. And then, years later, long after the academy had seen new generations pass through its gates, a man appeared on the ridge overlooking the east field. He was older now, beard fully white, his steps slower. He wore a weathered coat and a cap with no insignia. He carried nothing but a small satchel and a folded piece of paper. He didn't go to the main hall. He didn't speak to the administration. Instead, he stood at a distance, watching a group of cadets practice their drills. One of them slipped in the mud. The other stopped, helped him up. No teasing, no judgment, just unity. The man watched for a while longer, then turned to leave. As he walked back down the path toward the tree line, a young cadet sprinted after him, breathless. "Sir Wade, are you? Are you him?" The man paused. He didn't turn. The cadet continued, voice softer now. "I just wanted to say, thank you." The man nodded once, not in confirmation, not in denial, just a quiet acknowledgement. Then he disappeared down the path. Back at the academy, the cadet returned to his squad, didn't tell them what he saw, but the next morning, he left a folded note at the base of the memorial tree. It read, "Some footprints never fade, even when the boots are gone." And in that way, Elias Rohr remained not just in stories, or photos, or archived footage, but in decisions made in silence, in burdens carried with honor, and in 1,000 quiet moments where someone chose to lead without being seen. Because sometimes the ones who vanish are the ones who've actually been here all along, teaching us not how to follow, but how to walk forward with purpose when no one is watching.